Hello, everybody. So, the Unearthed Arcana feedback survey is officially open for playtest 8. So, if you want your voice to be heard, make sure to go to D&D Beyond and fill out that survey before January 2nd when it closes, because we are nearing the end of the playtest, given that we already have confirmed release dates for the books, which will come out in May, and I think there's only one more confirmed Player's Handbook playtest package that will be coming out after this, and then that's basically it as far as I'm aware. So if there's still something in the game that you don't like and you want to see changed, now is definitely the time to go to the feedback survey and start leaving feedback, not only for the content in Playtest 8, but also just content in the playtest in general, seeing as they do have a free answer section near the end. So, without further ado, I figured I would go back through playtest 8 as usual, this time focusing more on what I want to critique and give feedback on, as well as sort of reviewing some of my earlier thoughts that, with my first impressions, I hadn't really had time to ruminate on it now. So now that I've had time to think about it, talk to people who've done a proper playtest, things like that, I figured I'd give my revised thoughts and everything as usual. Though, once again, I will be focusing more on the martial side of the equation. I don't really have a ton to say on Druid specifically, but there is a lot to comment on with the Barbarian and the Monk. So, let's go ahead and get started on that. So, with the Barbarian, one of the first things I remember taking note of and being a little bit concerned about in my first impressions was the fact that they've now made it so that Rage can be refreshed on a short rest basically for free, and I was a little bit worried about multi-class builds. Having Rage recover on a short rest so early made it feel like it could potentially be too good to take just a single level of Barbarian and then get access to Rage, and then you don't really have to worry about the uses too much as long as your DM is at least somewhat lenient about short resting, which is something I do kind of prefer. So I was a little bit worried about that, but now that I've had some more time to think about it, I'm not actually that critical of it anymore. If anything, for one, strength is kind of an underutilized stat in 5e to begin with, so having the option to boost strength-based effects by dipping into Barbarian when combining it with another class, I think is actually kind of valid. And if you actually think about it, Rage is pretty limited in its use cases. They pretty specifically only work with strength-based weapons, and you cannot concentrate or cast any spells while raging, so even classes like the Paladin, who famously use strength as well, probably don't want to dip into Barbarian to do this. So really the only other class that this really would affect is likely the Fighter and maybe the Druid, depending on how much they use Wild Shape. But even then, I'm also curious, and this is something that I do want them to clarify, so this is something I would definitely give feedback on. It's a little bit unclear with the wording here, whether they meant that it was strength-based attacks with weapons and unarmed strikes, or specifically just strength-based attacks with weapons and any kind of unarmed strike. Because the obvious question here becomes, what happens when a monk takes a level in Barbarian to get Rage, because now even just that one level can give you a pretty significant damage bonus, even if you're using Dexterity to make unarmed strikes. So, I mean, I'm not about to complain about the monk getting stronger, but I am a little bit curious if that was intentional, and if it was, I feel like the wording should be more clear on that. And that is a common thing. Like, if you're ever unclear about the phrasing of something, that is definitely something to raise in the feedback survey so that they can clarify it in the full version. Now, while I am not concerned about the multi-class potential of Rage anymore, I am still concerned about how little it scales, and in fact, arguably, it now scales even less. The only way that Rage gets more powerful as you level is that the weapon mastery, or sorry, not the weapon mastery, the Rage damage bonus increases from 2 to 4 from level 1 to 20, as well as the number of rages you get. But again, the number of rages now feels less relevant now that you can recover rage on a short rest. So really, how much more useful is it to have 6 rages compared to, like, say 2 or 3, when you can still get back like several rages throughout the day by resting? So I do feel like there should be more of an incentive to actually be a full barbarian by actually making rage scale more. And I still feel like one of the best ways to do that is to grant the barbarian temporary hit points while raging that preferably refresh every single turn. One of the biggest problems with raging just in general is that the only actual defensive benefit that it provides is resistance to physical damage. And it's such a binary benefit that, because the problem is that if an enemy has any means of dealing non-physical damage, like if they're just a basic spellcaster, then they can bypass basically all defenses that rage would grant, and as a result, now it's just basically a small damage bonus and not much else. Even though the main class fantasy of the Barbarian is to be essentially the tankiest member of your team. So I feel like it needs a little bit more of a defensive boon that better both scales with level and is able to handle a wider variety of damage types. And I still think the best way to do that is, like I said, the temporary hit point bonus. You can have it scale where it's like an amount of temporary hit points equal to your level, and then maybe add your con modifier on top of that. And then that way, you know, at low levels, you're only getting like 4 temp HP per turn, and then at like mid levels, you're getting like 15. And it's like, it's not an insane amount to chew through, but it at least gives you a little bit of a buffer against more kinds of attacks than just physical attacks. But yeah, moving on though, I do want to talk a little bit more about the new Superstar feature of the Barbarian, which is Brutal Strike. I do think this is a great ability, and the only critique that I have for it is that I wish the Barbarian got access to it sooner. Because like I said, a lot of games only play in the first half of the levels. Like, a lot of games only go from level 1 to like maybe 10 or 12 at the highest before they start a new campaign. And a lot of modules are the same way. So while Brutal Strike is a great ability that gives the Barbarian really interesting and good tactical options, I do think that it should be available sooner. What I would maybe do is move a weaker version of it down to, say, level 5. And, like, that would make level 5 a very big level for the Barbarian. But like I said, you could make it a little bit weaker, like, instead of it being a D10 of damage, maybe make it a D6 to start, and then at level 9 it upgrades to a D10, or maybe even a D12, if we're feeling saucy. And then that also opens up room to add even more potential talents to the ability, because right now you get Forceful Blow and Hamstring Blow, and then later on you get Staggering and Sundering, so that you have a total of 4. But if we added another tier of it where you get it at level 5 first, we could move maybe Hamstring Blow down to that level, because I think that's actually a very good tanking ability. One interaction that a lot of people might not have realized is that you can combine Hamstring Blow, which reduces speed by 15 feet, with a weapon with the Slow Mastery, which reduces speed by 10 feet, for a total of a 25-foot speed reduction. And so against most enemies that only have a 30-foot move speed, that means you're effectively rooting them in place, which is very much a tank thing to do, so that enemies cannot just simply run past you and get to your more squishy friends. And so I think having that be one of the earlier options would be great, and to further reinforce the tankiness of the Barbarian, you could even do something like the goading attack maneuver as an option as well. Goading attack, of course, being the Battlemaster maneuver that, you know, a lot of these other abilities are being pulled from anyways, that I think obviously fits the Barbarian because its main effect is that you impose disadvantage on the target if they attack anybody other than you. So it's encouraging them to attack the Barbarian. And it's also worth noting that this would actually be a significantly weaker version of goading attack than what the Battlemaster gets, because the only way the Barbarian can activate this ability is while doing reckless attack, which means that they'd be also giving the opponent advantage to hit them, so that now it's a choice between disadvantage to hit anybody else or advantage to hit the Barbarian. So, that I think that works as a lower level version of this ability. And then at level 9, you could just add Forceful Blow and the stat upgrade, or you could add something else as well. Maybe a sweeping attack could be a fun one, or like a whirlwind attack. Either way, like letting you do something that hits multiple people instead of it being just all single target damage. I think there's some interesting things you could do, but even if you only got one new ability at level 9, I think that would be fine because of you also getting the damage increase, and then you'd have 3 total to choose from. So adding only 1 at that level isn't really that bad of a deal. And finally, moving on to the subclass, which I still do love the flavor of with the World Tree. I still think it's great. I do think the change with Branches of the Tree, where it triggers at the start of an opponent's turn, is a great change. As well as Battering Roots, letting you do push or topple attacks. The one critique I still have is at level 14. So the old version of this, if I can pull that up real quick. Yes, here it is. So the old version of Travel Along the Tree it had no combat abilities, but it had a really cool and fun utility ability where it would let the Barbarian actually cast a teleportation spell or a plane shift spell, and they could actually guide their party to another plane of existence, which I thought was great in terms of flavor because it is the World Tree Barbarian. And also, marshals don't normally get this kind of utility. So I think that it's really cool to let the Barbarian be like, oh yes, I will be the one that can guide the party across dimensions. That's like a really cool thing to let them do. But I understand why they wanted to change it, because it didn't offer any actual combat utility. Well, I feel like this is still an overcorrection, where what they've done is they've made it so that now you have a really, really good combat ability where you can effectively teleport for free as a bonus action up to 60 feet whenever you're raging, and that's awesome, but they've kind of gotten rid of the utility. Like, all you can do in terms of utility is teleport your allies up to 500 feet, and that's it. I feel like we could have both. Like, this is level 14. We're in tier 3 at this point. Giving the Barbarian 2 really cool features at the same time is, I think, fair. And I think that having the ability to plane shift once a day and the ability to teleport as a bonus action during combat would be great in terms of flavor, utility, combat. Like, it would be the whole package. So I don't see why they can't just bring that back and combine it with this ability. I think that would be great for the game. Moving on to Druid, like I said, I don't have a ton to comment on here. I've barely ever played Druid, so I'm not really that well versed in them, and I've rarely ever even had somebody play as a Druid in a party that I've been in. So I'm kind of out of my depth here. Though, that said, I do still feel like the Wild Shape templates from one of the older playtests was a good idea that just was executed really poorly. I would maybe give some feedback saying just that I really liked the idea of the templates, and I think they would have gotten a lot better feedback if they were just better balanced and had a little bit more options and versatility to them. The current version of Wild Shape, I do think, is still an improvement on the 5e one, but I do think the templates could be worth another shot. Maybe just giving them a little bit more versatility and whatnot. But anyways, like I said, I don't have a ton to really comment on the Druid, so I'm just going to move on straight to the Monk. So, when it comes to the Monk, the biggest first thing that a lot of people have been talking about, discussing, and sort of debating the intentionality of is the hand-to-crossbow issue. They specify that monks are able to use simple melee weapons, but then when it comes to martial weapons, they only specify that it's martial weapons with the light property, which does include the hand-to-crossbow. So that is kind of a weird thing that is now the only ranged option for a monk. And that's, like, I'm not opposed to the monk having ranged options, but it almost feels unintentional and like a loophole in what they said. Like they might have meant martial melee weapons, and or maybe just didn't realize or remember that hand crossbows are technically light weapons, and they just assumed like, oh well, a light weapon means a melee weapon, right? So like it is a little bit confusing as to whether that's intentional, but they did also phrase stunning strike in a way where, because it says monk weapon and not unarmed strike exclusively, that means that you can technically use a hand crossbow to inflict stunning strike. And so, like, but again, it doesn't talk about ranged weapons, it just says monk weapons. So, again, it's a little bit confusing, and I just really want them to clarify that. And honestly, if they want to give the monk ranged options, I feel like they should just say simple weapons in general, because that would give the monk access to things like crossbows and short bows, and then they could just use that instead, and then they could specify martial melee weapons with the light property, and then you don't have to worry about this hand crossbow weirdness. If anything, it feels like something that should be accessible to the Kensei monk, which is always the monk that was more specialized about using more kinds of weapons, and then like they could just do something like that. But like I said, they could just let the monk use short bows or whatnot, and then have that work out like that. Moving back to Stunning Strike, though, so in addition to the weird loophole where you can technically apply it from range, I do honestly feel like Stunning Strike should specify at the very least a melee attack, even with greater support for ranged, because it's just such a powerful ability that it makes sense that it's something that you would have to close in for melee in order to activate. But even then, so I do still think that while it is technically a nerf compared to the older version, where you could spend your key willy-nilly in order to just do as many stunning strikes per turn as you wanted, I do think it is still healthier, both for the monk and the game in general, to limit it to once per turn. The one weird thing about it, though, is that right now the opponent only takes damage on a successful save, and that seems weird to me that they don't take damage on a failed save. Like, I would just maybe rephrase this as just when you spend the key point, they take additional damage equal to your martial arts die and your wisdom mod. And then after they take the damage, they make the saving throw, and then they are either stunned or not. Because that also creates the weird situation where, like, some monsters are immune to being stunned. So, would they not want to willingly fail the saving throw in order to avoid taking the damage while being immune to the stun? Like, that's just kind of a really weird and obviously very metagamey interaction that I feel like should just be closed up so that it's not an issue anymore. Like, just make it so that the monk always gets bonus damage, and then it's just a saving throw whether or not they also get stunned on top of that. It's not going to be the end of the world if they're stunned and take a little bit of damage on top of that. Like, the stun is always going to be the bigger factor there. Moving on, though, to level 9, I still feel like level 9 is probably the weakest level in the new monk. It's just so it lets you move across liquids and run on walls or run up walls or whatever, and it feels like something that should be available earlier, because it's like the actual combat utility of this I feel is very niche, because it varies heavily based on the campaign you're in. If you're doing a lot of interior actual dungeon crawling and stuff, and you have a lot of enemies that are doing things like, say, casting grease on the ground, and you need to avoid it, then yeah, like, running on a wall could really help with that. But, like, and, like, out of combat, I could also see it being useful, since you can just, oh, you need to climb up this castle wall, I'll just run up it, and things like that. But, like, in a lot of other situations where, like, if you're doing a lot of outside combat, like where you're in a forest, like, is it really going to be that useful? Like, I guess you could run up a tree and then, like, jump from it or something. Like, it feels like a weird thing to take up an entire level on its own. And it's also at such a weirdly high to middling high level on top of that. Because, like, it feels like a monk should be able to do something like this before level 9, in my opinion. I've seen some people comment that it's a little bit weird to make an ability specifically about this because, ironically enough, it means that before level 9, it kind of encourages DMs to not allow the monk to do things like run on walls and stuff, even by making a check or something, because it's an ability that they specifically get later on. So, what I would like to see is maybe just move the level 9 ability and like wrap it up with slow fall, because like slow fall and acrobatic movement feels like they're kind of part of the same brand. Like you could just rename level 4 to acrobatic movement and include the ability to walk on water, run up walls, and reduce fall damage, all under that sort of general category of enhanced acrobatic movement. And I think that would work. And then, to replace level 9, I do think it would be cool if the monk got at least one more defensive feature at some point that they could, like, reliably use every turn. They don't really get a enhancement to their deflect attacks ability until level 13. And, like, past that, it's not really until level 18 that they get another actual defensive power. So at level 9, one ability that I've seen talked about a fair bit that I really, really like is the ability to get multiple reactions. That's something that doesn't really exist in the game yet, and so it would feel really unique to the monk as something that they can do. And it doesn't have to necessarily be that they just get 2 reactions per turn. What I would probably do is make it so that they can pay a key point in order to get an extra reaction. So it's like, oh, you make an opportunity attack, and then if you want to do another one, you have to spend a key. Or, I mean, and maybe you think that just allowing reactions in general might be too much, and I could maybe see that. But, like, at the very least, the ability to use deflect attacks without consuming their reaction by spending a key point, I think could be a worthwhile ability. Because then that way now, you know, they have, like, 3 archers shooting at them. They could just spend a key point twice, and then do it 3 times, and then, you know, so on and so forth. And I mean, and that could be really expensive, too. Keep in mind that they can only do the redirection attack by spending another key point on top of that. So, like, you know, deflecting 3 arrows, then sending them back at their attackers, that's a 5 key point ability right there that's not even being used on your own turn. So, like, it still encourages good key point management while giving the monk just a slight boost in their defensive qualities, which I think would be a nice ability to get around that level before they finally get the proper upgrade at level 13 so that they can deflect anything. Then, at level 10, we get the Heightened Discipline, which is, I still think, a really great upgrade that was much needed for the class, and I love pretty much all of these abilities. In my original initial impressions video, I believe I talked about wishing that Step of the Wind applied, or allowed you to at least force an opponent to make a saving throw, or be carried with you, so that you could use it kind of both offensively and to, like, move allies around. However, I do think that with the new grapple rules, this isn't as necessary as I thought it was. I don't think I had looked at the new grapple conditions in the playtest at the time, and what's interesting about it is that the way grappling works is it no longer hinders your own move speed as the grappler, at least not to the point where it's 0, like the grappled person. Instead, it only makes you cost 1 extra foot of movement per foot of movement, unless the thing you're grabbing is really, really small. So what that means is that a monk who already has lots of movement to spend, they can potentially grapple multiple enemies and still carry them around the battlefield at a fairly brisk pace, especially if they combine it with their Step of the Wind ability in order to double their move speed and do all kinds of other fun stuff. So I do think that it isn't really necessary to make it so that Step of the Wind lets you also grab enemies, because that's kind of built into the game already with how grappling and unarmed strikes works now. And finally, to round off my critiques about the base class, one thing, I do like the level 15 ability, Perfect Discipline, which essentially makes it so that every combat you always start with a minimum of 4 key points. And I do think that, you know, the new wording and the way that that works is great. However, I do think that it would be maybe just a little bit more flavorful if the amount of key you got back was equal to your wisdom modifier. Because, like, by the time you're level 15, 16, you probably have an 18 in wisdom anyways, so I don't think it would nerf the ability. And, like, if you're neglecting your wisdom by level 15, like, as a monk, like, what are you doing, right? And plus, that would also mean that it scales a little bit as you get deeper into tier 4 play, because obviously you can keep upgrading your wisdom, and you could potentially have a wisdom of 20 so that you recover 5, and then at level 20 you could potentially have a wisdom of 26, which means you'd be starting every combat with 8 key points at that point. And so I just think that it would synergize a little bit more with the other kind of, like, high slash epic level monk abilities, to make it so that it would be like, oh, now I improve my wisdom, now I always have even more key, that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, that will about do it for the base class. So moving on to the Warrior of the Hand. Again, I do think that this is generally a good subclass. I think that, phrasing the open hand technique like this is pretty good. One criticism I do have for the level 6 ability, though, is that it gives you yet another bonus action ability, which means that, like, because the open hand monk is already being tugged, or really the monk in general, their bonus action is in high demand. Like, you have your flurry, you have your step of the wind, you have your patient defense, and then on top of that you have your heal, and your flurry is being buffed. So now these two abilities kind of are anti-synergistic with each other, to the point where it's like, I almost feel like it would be better if Wholeness of Body consumed your main action instead of your bonus action. Like, ironically enough, that feels less valuable to the monk than their bonus action, especially when their flurry is buffed in this manner. So maybe at the very least I would change this to be so that you can use it as a bonus action or an action, so that way you have a little bit more flexibility with how you use it. If you wanted to go crazy, you could maybe make it so that it's just as a free action at the start of your turn you can use it, and then that way it doesn't consume either. But I would be happy if you just changed it from exclusively a bonus action ability to letting you do either one, so that, that way you can still heal yourself and do a flurry of blows, and so on and so forth. I still think Fleet Step is like the superstar ability for the subclass, being able to always dash as a bonus action in addition to everything else. It definitely helps soften the blow that Wholeness of Body has of consuming your bonus action. But I still feel like Wholeness of Body contradicts with, open hand technique. So I think that Fleet Step only comes online at level 11, so, like, when you get it at level 6, that's like 5 levels before you finally get the ability to do something else while healing yourself. And then finally, at level 17, we have Quivering Palm, which a lot of people are definitely not happy about, and I think I have soured on it even more in its current state. It feels like it's trying to, do different things at the same time. Like, they wanted to make it so that it's no longer an instant death ability, but they also made it so that you can activate it more easily, but then in turn it's also more expensive and it deals less damage. Like, in my opinion, what I would do is either just revert it back to how it was and make it an instant death ability, because this is level 17 we're talking about. Like, I'm pretty sure the wizard can cast Wish by now. Let the monk just punch somebody to death, you know? But, like, if they don't want to give the monk an instant death ability, then I would maybe make it so that you're no longer limited to only one creature at a time. Because that way, and maybe reduce the cost to, like, 3 if it's only going to be, a certain amount of force damage. Because then, if you're able to hit multiple enemies, you could do some really cool stuff where, like, you run into a group of enemies, and then you punch, like, 5 different people in one turn. And then, on your next turn, you activate the ability, and then all 5 people take a ton of force damage out of nowhere. Or, like, you could threaten a whole group of enemies with it, effectively. And then, like, that would be really cool and kind of fit into the monk fantasy a little bit better than this sort of middle ground version of that ability. And obviously, of course, if you were to let you hit multiple people with the ability, I would probably limit it by your wisdom modifier. So, like, if you have a 20 wisdom, you can hit up to 5 people. If you got 26 wisdom at level 20, you can hit up to 8 people with it. And then that would, I'd probably call that a day. So yeah, I think that'll do it for the monk. So to finish things up, remember, like I said at the start, if you have any questions about the specific way that a certain thing works, that is definitely something to comment on the playtest. One example from the spells that I noticed after talking about it with some other people is Conjure Elemental specifically. The way it works is that, when a creature moves next to it, you can hit them, and if you hit them, you can restrain them, and they're pulled into the elemental space. But when they break free from being restrained, it doesn't specify like if they are still in the elemental space or if they move to say a nearby unoccupied space, which is usually how that kind of ability is phrased. So that's something that I would definitely want clarification on, as well as the fact that, like, theoretically they can restrain themselves, but then they're still adjacent to the elemental, so moving away theoretically would re-trigger the elemental's attack again. So, like, it's this kind of, like, weird, awkward thing that, like, again, I just kind of want more clarification on it. I do think the buffs to healing magic are fine. Healing has always been kind of in an awkward place in 5e, so having more healing options, that are worthwhile is probably not a bad idea. And then, like I said at the start, the end of the survey always features a sort of free essay option where you can kind of talk about whatever, whether it pertains to this particular instance of the survey or an earlier one. And I know one thing I'm definitely going to talk about is the fighter. I feel like they've almost fixed all of the other martial classes, or at least given them abilities that make them more fun and interesting to play. Like, the monk now has much more varied and interesting options for what they spend their bonus action on, whether they're spending ki or not. The barbarian now has brutal strikes to give them what is effectively combat maneuvers, but something that they can do for free every single turn. The rogue has something similar with cutting strikes, where they can modify their sneak attacks with additional debuffs and whatnot to apply to their opponents. So the only one left out of the picture here now is the fighter, who they keep trying to make them work as this sort of like weapon mastery master, by letting them buff the way weapon masteries work, but so far I feel like they keep failing at that, and I really just want them to add something akin to like brutal strikes or cunning strikes that give the fighter a proper tactical option that they can do every turn without having to be a battle master. And so, like, I really would like to see something like that. And, like, if they really want to stick with weapon masteries, I still feel like a really good buff that fighters could get exclusive to them is the ability to just add any weapon mastery to an attack and combine it with that weapon's normal mastery so that they can do 2 weapon masteries on a single attack. Like, that's already something that the Barbarian can do with the World Tree subclass, where they can eventually just apply the push or topple mastery in addition to other mastery properties on a single attack. And so, like, if other martial subclasses can get stuff like that, I feel like that's something that would fit the fighter base class really well as just a general ability of theirs that both kind of fits the whole weapon master kind of theme while also giving them something unique to do. And plus, being able to combine that with other subclasses like Battle Master so that you could do one weapon mastery, a second weapon mastery, and then a Battle Master maneuver all on a single attack could be a really fun thing for the fighter to have an option for. Anyways, I think that'll finally wrap up my sort of feedback for playtest 8. So like I said, remember to go to the website and fill out the survey if you have any thoughts, or even just want to comment on what you like. And as always, I'm always happy to continue the conversation down in the comments below. If you have any more thoughts on playtest 8 or things that you hope to come in the next edition of Dungeons & Dragons, make sure to let me know. And if you like this video, make sure to give me a like. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe so that you can get notified of when I make more videos in the future. But until then, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.